Implicit bias training, promoting equity in the workplace.
On the screen is the lesson outline for the training session. We will be talking about implicit bias in the workplace. We have a pre-test, and then we'll go into the learning objectives, theories. We have 3 activities and a post-test to wrap the training session up. To kick off this training, we will have you complete an initial assessment. This initial assessment is to gauge where you're currently at in your understanding of implicit bias. This is an individual assignment, and we encourage full transparency and honesty when providing your answers. To access this test, you can scan the QR code on the screen. If you do not have the technology to scan that, we can hand out a printout version of it, which is the exact same version, and we will be able to collect the same data from each.
So why are you taking this training? While we will cover exact learning objectives next, we wanted to provide some context of why you are here in this room. We are excited to welcome to this training all leaders of people with a variety of knowledge and experience to learn about implicit bias. This training will teach about what implicit bias is and will be relevant to leaders in all stages of your career. Everyone should find value in refreshing on the topic, learning more, or practicing.
We have developed several SMART goals for this training. The first goal is, at the end of this training, you, the participant, will understand implicit bias, know examples of people frequently affected by implicit bias, and understand its impact on organizations. The second, participants will learn strategies for identifying implicit bias in themselves, as well as in their organization, through the training activities. And the third, this training will provide individuals and organization-wide approaches for reducing the harmful effects of implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are unconscious negative associations that individuals may hold against a particular population or people group. Actions as a result of implicit bias do not come from conscious decision-making. Instead, these actions are caused by the part of the brain that is responsible for quick reactions.
Implicit biases typically form in regards to social groups. Examples of social groups include age, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, social class, and religion, just to name a few.
Implicit bias can be developed at a very young age. Here are some examples of how someone could form an unconscious negative association. Through exposure to adults who possess a particular bias, through receiving negative information from the media and cultural influencers, or through growing up in a homogeneous environment.
We can ground our understanding of the theoretical basis of implicit bias in System 1 and System 2 thinking. Daniel Kahneman developed this theory of thinking with System 1 thinking being quick, unconscious, emotional thinking that is automatic in the brain, whereas System 2 thinking is effortful and slow thinking, where we rationally think about the topic and apply logic. So how does this impact and apply to implicit bias? We apply system thinking to implicit and explicit bias by comparing the two. Implicit bias follows System 1 thinking. Implicit bias is unconscious and decisions are influenced subconsciously, aka we are not aware of how these biases influence our decisions. In fact, implicit biases typically contradict values that we express to others. On the other hand, explicit bias represents System 2 thinking. These biases are the ones that we are conscious and aware of and choose to be. These biases are apparent to us and others in the verbiage that we use and the behavior that we exhibit. We are aware of our thinking and open about the values that are true to us in explicit bias. So how does implicit bias show up in the workplace? As we covered before, implicit bias typically forms in regards to social groups which are present in any diverse work group. On the screen are a couple of examples that you or others around you may have experienced. You may see racial implicit bias when candidates who have a typical white name are more frequently called on, since the interviewer has an unconscious preference toward those with white names. An implicit bias against the LGBTQIA+ community would be asking a female colleague if they have a boyfriend, assuming that they are heterosexual. Another example includes when hiring managers unknowingly interview and choose people who went to the same college as them. Implicit biases may also be seen as microaggressions against certain ethnicities and appear when a person compliments their peer on their English skills when the peer was born in the United States. Age biases also show up when managers choose older employees for technology training versus their younger peers based on assumptions. The key point for all of these examples is that the person making these decisions are not purposefully excluding people or making these decisions on purpose. However, the impact is the same even if they are not aware.
As mentioned in the last slide, these implicit biases in the workplace are oftentimes unintentional. These implicit biases can create negative experiences for all employees involved. In this slide, we will talk about some implications of that. Employees that fall victim to implicit biases oftentimes have poor work experiences. They find there is limited opportunities for advancement in their organization as they do not feel included. Organizations with high levels of biases oftentimes suffer high turnover rates due to employee dissatisfaction. This can also lead to organizations suffering productivity losses and may even run the risk of encountering legal challenges. These are all implications that affect leaders, staff, and organizations as a whole. So, how can organizations address these challenges to help decrease implicit biases in the workplace? Some ways in which organizations can focus on implicit bias is through awareness training. We will be seeing this done during this training today. Organizations can also discuss the types of biases that may occur in the workplace. This is also something that will be discussed in today's training. Another form of reduction is through the creation of structures, conducting employee surveys. When doing so, we want to make sure that, if possible, to include past employees to receive additional feedback. And lastly, through organizational diversity audits. As mentioned in the last slide, awareness training is one way that implicit biases can be reduced. Many organizations use this method as it has been proven effective. Interactive workshops can bring awareness to one's own implicit bias. They enhance engagement and participation. They provide immediate feedback through group discussions. There is an increase in retention and understanding of the material being discussed. And it helps participants develop critical thinking skills. For this reason, we will go through some activities in this training to help you better understand what implicit bias is and how this plays a role in your organization and in your position.
And now we will practice our understanding of implicit bias by going through some activities.
The first activity is called Who Do You Trust? To complete this training, you will need to have a paper and a writing utensil for all the participants. In this activity, participants write down a list of 10 people that they can trust. Each person gets a different line than the others. The instructor starts naming different classifications like female, male, heterosexual, bisexual, African American, single, European American, divorced, etc. The participants will then put a mark next to each person that shares that category with them. For example, if a person who is Christian has people on the list who are also a Christian, they would mark it. Participants should then be encouraged to share the results with the group or the people at their table. The purpose of this activity is to show people who is in their inner circle. By doing so, they will see who they have an affinity for, and they should be more aware of their bias. This training should be done in a classroom type setting with adequate lighting and no distractions. This training could be done at any organization, as it wouldn't hurt to know your affinities and how they affect your life. The second activity for this training is called Detecting Bias. For this, you will need 6 flip chart paper sheets or 6 poster boards plus markers for either option. In this activity, participants will be split into 6 groups. In their groups, they will be assigned to one of the flip charts or poster boards. Each flip chart will be a different bias. For example, some of the different biases that you can put down on the sheet would be gender bias, the halo effect, the horn effect, ethnic and racial bias, age bias, and affinity bias. They will have 2 to 3 minutes to write down what their bias looks like and how to prevent the bias from happening. After the time is up, have them go to the next flip chart. Keep repeating this until the groups end up at their original chart. Then the groups will pick someone to represent their chart. They will summarize the 2 sections of the chart. After this is done, open the floor to an open discussion on what they noticed, similarities, differences, was this difficult to complete, etc. The purpose of this activity is to allow groups to think and discuss how different biases can look in the workplace and in everyday life. By doing so, they will be more aware on how to prevent bias, how to address it, and what they think it could look like. This training should be done in an environment that either allows for students to move around to different flip charts on the wall or be able to shift to different tables to complete this activity. This could be done at any organization to reduce individual bias or when implicit preferences need to be reduced in the workplace.
Activity number 3 is about deconstructing our biases. This activity will be discussion based. No materials will be needed unless the participants want to take notes and they want to structure their comments and arguments for the discussion that way. If that's the case, then the trainers will provide them pen and paper for it. The trainers will act as moderators for this discussion, and they will use the questions on the screen to guide the group along and lead to a fruitful and effective conversation. We will talk about where our biases stem from, whether we're encouraged or not to dismantle our own biases, what may trigger those biases, but in our personal lives, what could potentially contribute to those biases that we then bring into the workplace, and if we have ever potentially have had a bias towards somebody, and have we ever experienced bias from someone else. We have reached the post-assessment and feedback portion of the training. The first QR code takes you to a post-assessment that you will take. This is an individual assignment. It will be the same process as the pre-assessment. If there is no technology to access this assessment, printouts will be available that are identical to the digital assessment. The second QR code you can scan to provide us feedback to the training and the training material, structure, and the presenters. This is the evaluation plan for this training program. This is how we assess whether the intended purposes of this training actually come to fruition. So our intended purpose is to bring awareness to implicit bias and how we can combat that in the workplace. Our levels 1 and 2 are on the previous slide. This is a more immediate measurement that we can take. We can do the reaction level, which is their feedback, learning, which is their post-assessment. Levels 3 and 4 will come at a later time. This is when we let that knowledge sink in and they can change their behaviors based off of that knowledge. Level 3, which is behavior or skill-based, that could be assessed through a survey to their direct supervisor, as they are the ones they come in contact with the most, and they can observe and be a better source for their changed behavior from the training up until the time of evaluation. Level 4, and this will be more towards the training itself, to see a self-assessment of whether they feel their own attitudes have changed since the training to the time of further evaluation. And this is more, levels 3 and 4 are a more of a long-term plan to ensure the quality of the training.
Thank you so much for attending this training, and we hope you learned more about how you can combat implicit biases in the workplace.
Listed on this slide are the resources we have used to aid in the construction of this training session and the evaluation plan. Thank you.